Well, good morning, everyone. I am so thankful for the opportunity to speak before you this morning. I want to start with reading 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, the last verse in that chapter we were just in. It says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast and movable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." I want to ask why. Why? Why would we be so steadfast? Why, in your situation right now, with the week that you're looking forward to, maybe different trials, different opportunities, why would you be steadfast and immovable? If you looked at the news this morning, you probably found reasons to fear, reasons to have anxiety about this week or the future. Why would you be steadfast and immovable? And why would you choose to abound in the work of the Lord when really there's a lot of different distractions? There's a lot of different things that we could do with our time, with our money, with our thoughts. Why would you choose to abound in the work of the Lord? What motivated the early church? What motivated those first groups of Christians to spread the gospel in the entire Roman Empire? When we look at passages like Acts 8, and persecution is on the rise, Stephen has just been martyred for the faith. It says in Acts 8, they were scattered. They were scattered but not silenced. They were scattered and they preached the word. Just ordinary people like you and me. Not just the great speakers of the time or the most educated, just everyone went about preaching the word. We think about these people. They were thrown in the Colosseum. They were put on crosses. They lost their jobs. They lost their families. Why? What was at the center of their motivation? We see that in chapter 15. They were confident in the resurrection. They believed it like it was historical fact. They believed it so firmly that they put their necks on the line, sometimes literally, because they believed in the resurrection. More than a myth, more than just a good story, they believed it happened. And that's really what we're talking about today. I ask to do something a little strange. I've been studying the resurrection a lot this year in preparation for some of the teen studies, especially the theme of the resurrection in the book of Acts and the epistles. And I found that it is a major theme. In Acts, if you look at all the different speeches, all the different sermons, you'll find it in almost every one that the resurrection is talked about. And you'll see it throughout the epistles. And most of all in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I was looking at this and I was so encouraged, so inspired by this chapter a couple months ago. I've been wanting to do this lesson for about 8 months now, but a couple months ago I said, hey, I'd really like to do this in 2 lessons because they really build on each other. So the one we're talking about this morning is confidence in his resurrection. And I invite you back at 5 p.m. because we'll talk about the meaning of the resurrection. We really need to understand both. As I studied, I thought this is something that we need to be firm in because the first century church was so firm in this. Of first importance, Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some facts about the resurrection and look at possible explanations for those facts. And I'll pause here to say just a few things. First of all, we're going to be covering a lot of information today. I've prepared some worksheets in the back. If you have not picked up one of those, it'll really help organize the thoughts of this morning. Please raise your hand. I know we're not used to raising our hands and such, but please raise your hand. Don't be ashamed. There's some folks in the back who can help you find one if you need one. Also, we got a couple up here, gentlemen. Got one back there. Yeah. All right. Yeah, just keep your hand raised. I know it's uncomfortable. Don't be ashamed. It's all right. And just a couple other things. So you're probably here because you already believe in the resurrection. I think I know what sort of audience I'm speaking to. Some of you may be less confident than others, and that's okay. I really want this lesson to engage your doubts, engage your skepticism about different parts of this, right? You may be confident, but not as confident to put your neck on the line for Christ. I hope this helps affirm your faith. And also, hopefully, these facts help you convince some people who are new to this idea of resurrection. I know I was definitely thankful when earlier this week, these exact concepts we're studying came up in a discussion with someone. I was glad they're on the front of my mind because people need to know this. People need to know that there is reason behind Jesus rising from the dead. And finally, I invite you back at 5 p.m. to continue this discussion. It's important not just to know that it happened, but what it means. So 3 key facts that most skeptic historians accept. The first one is Jesus existed and was crucified. Most people, even if they're skeptics, they'll believe he actually existed. He's not just a fairy tale, right? He existed and was crucified. Now, I'll say most skeptic historians, because there are some who will disagree with this, but in most discussions, they'll accept that he existed and was crucified. Next, that Jesus' tomb was found empty. This is a very important fact. Jesus' tomb was found empty. If Jesus' tomb was not found empty, this idea of resurrection would have never spread from Jerusalem outwards, because simply, someone would have just opened the grave and said, here's the body, everyone be quiet, right? Most historians will accept that Jesus' tomb was found empty. And then finally, various people firmly believe that Jesus was raised, even if they were inclined not to believe. What this is not saying is that skeptics will accept that Jesus actually rose from the dead. They have other explanations for those facts, but they'll say, yeah, people believed it. People believed that they saw something. Otherwise, they would not have done the things that they did for the sake of Christ. So this morning we'll go through 6 different explanations of these facts, right? There are a lot of different explanations. We'll go through each one individually and understand the case for or against those explanations. And I want you during this time to really put your skeptical hat on, right? Imagine you're on the outside looking in, looking at these facts. What would you think? What would you think if you were in Judea or Corinth in the first century when these things are being written? And you hear reports that this man named Jesus, he was a teacher, he was crucified, his tomb was found empty, and that his followers are saying, oh, hey, he's risen, right? What would you be thinking? What sort of evidence would you need to see to be convinced that what they are saying was true? So let's look at each of these explanations. I'm going to put them all on here, and we'll go through each one individually. The first one is the resurrection was all legend, right? It was just a myth that came up over time. Certain guys like Bart Ehrman, if you've heard of him, he'll just say, it's all legend. The tomb was lost, and people hallucinated his appearance. This is one that's gotten a lot of more recent focus, that the tomb was lost. He was buried in a mass grave somewhere, and then people just had hallucinations. The third is that Jesus was never dead. He just had a nice 3-day nap and then woke up. Fourth one is that Jewish authorities or Roman authorities or someone else, like a grave robber, took the body. The fifth one is that the disciples took the body, right? This is the one that's reported in Matthew as what the Jewish authorities were telling people. All right, disciples took the body. And then finally, Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, if we take a step back and think, what are possible explanations for these facts? I've challenged different groups of people, an agnostic earlier this week, a Hindu earlier this year, and some of the young Christian men in June. I said, is there any other explanation for the facts? Could there be any other theoretical explanation for what could have happened to the body of Jesus. And over, it's one of these six. Really, everyone who is rational, who knows a bit of history, has to conclude that one of these six is what happened to the body of Jesus. So let's go one by one through these and see a case for each of them and what might be reasonable or not reasonable about each. First, the resurrection is a legend. People will say, oh, it's kind of like Santa Claus, May have had some historical roots, but over the course of centuries kind of ballooned into this fanciful tale of somebody, clothed in a red robe, descends down a chimney and gives presents to children. Well, this doesn't make sense for several reasons. First of all, that the resurrection is spoken of in very early sources. 1 Corinthians 15 is written, and most people will agree is written in the mid-first century, 53 or 54. And if you look in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, it says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Paul is saying what he's about to say, verse 3 through 7, is something he received. Some scholars will even say this is a mantra that was repeated among early Christians of the facts of Jesus' resurrection. Some people will even date that mantra in verse 3 through 7 as something that originated in the 5 years after Jesus' resurrection. It's very early. It's too early for legends to be made. Simply, there's too many people alive to just make this stuff up. And also, it's spoken of by 5 different sources. So the 5 would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then 1 Corinthians. Now, you look at those 5, and you study them and compare them. They all have details that the others do not, right? Which might cause some people to doubt, actually. Well, why don't they all say the same story, all the same details? Well, if you think about a crime scene, right? You think about a crime scene in which there's 5 different witnesses, and then if you interviewed those witnesses afterwards, what would happen if they all told all of the same details? All of the exact same details of what happened. What would you start to think as an investigator? You'd start to think that they got in a back room somewhere and compared notes and made sure all the details were aligned. You'd start to think that they started to make up this story themselves. But what you see in the gospel is 5 different perspectives on the same events. It's fascinating to compare these, and they make an interesting mesh of stories that all line up together and lock in together. There's 5 different sources, not just one. And also, these accounts don't bear the marks of legends. They have embarrassing little details about how some of them doubted at different times and different appearances. They have some strange details that aren't what you read about in fiction novels. And I'll share one example of a legend. This is the Gospel of Peter, okay? And I need to say a couple things about this. It's not a real gospel. This was written in the 2nd century. It was written by someone who was not Peter but claimed to be Peter, and it was rejected by the early church. They knew there's a number of things in here that did not line up with other Christian writings written by, inspired by God. But it's got some interesting features that show what a legend looks like. It says, and this is verse 35 of the Gospel of Peter, "But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it 2 by 2 in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven, and they saw that the heavens were opened, and that 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and come near the sepulcher." Okay, so we're tracking it. Some of this kind of aligns with things we've read in the Gospels. And then verse 39 it says, "And while they were relating what they had seen, again they see 3 males now. We have come out from the sepulcher with the 2 supporting the other one, and a cross following them." Okay, so there's this cross that's floating behind the men somehow. "And the head of the 2 reaching into heaven," so the angels' heads are in heaven, "but of the one being led out by the hand, going beyond the heavens." So apparently Jesus' head is above the heavens. And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep? And an obeisance was heard from the cross. Yes. So now the cross is speaking about the resurrection. This is clear signs of legend. They took little bits of the truth and then expanded them for dramatic effect. So is it a legend? Obviously not. Not plausible. Number 2, the body was placed in the wrong tomb and people hallucinated. Why does this not make sense? Well, several reasons. First of all, the body was placed nearby to the crucifixion in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb and with several witnesses. If we look in John chapter 19, verse 41 and 42, you don't need to turn there, I'll just read it here. Now in the place where he was crucified, there is a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So I don't know how you imagine the cross and the grave. I always imagine them as very separate locations. But we see in John this detail that they were very close together. That Jesus is taken down from the cross and the grave was right there. And it wasn't just an unmarked grave or a grave pit for crucifixion victims, but it's clear that this is Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. All 4 Gospels attest to this fact, and there's actually very few details that are shown in all 4 Gospels. If you line them all up, they usually include different details of different accounts. This one is talked about in all 4. Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And Joseph of Arimathea wasn't a outgoing disciple. He wasn't one of the apostles. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the same group that put Jesus to death. So it'd be such a strange detail for early disciples to make up. Something that would be easily disproven, that Jesus was buried in such a prominent location. It'd be like saying that my grandpa was buried next to Abraham Lincoln. Right? It'd be too easy to disprove that fact. His grave location would be too well known just to make up. And also it was with several witnesses. Right? Who witnessed the grave location? Well, you'd first have Pilate, right? Pilate, or at least some Roman soldiers, saw him being taken down from the cross. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, which were Jewish authorities, and several women were present at the grave. There's no way they just lost the grave during this process. But also, it doesn't explain the appearances. Some people will say, well, they just hallucinated. They thought they believed something, but they just hallucinated. And hallucinations do happen, right? You may have hallucinated in the past. It's a well-documented medical phenomenon where somebody believes that they saw something. It could happen because of illness, right? It could happen because of drugs or some other thing, right? But what doesn't happen is mass hallucinations. There is no historical precedent for a large group of people. I mean, 1 Corinthians says 500 people all saw something that they believed was physically in front of them. That is historically unprecedented, and we don't have any examples of that happening ever. So the idea of mass hallucinations does not make sense. Possibility number 2 is not plausible. Possibility number 3, Jesus was never dead, he just fainted. This one's kind of silly. I mean, honestly, there's probably not too many people who still believe this. This was more common like 50, 60 years ago. Jesus is never dead. It doesn't make sense. The tomb was guarded, right? I don't know if you've like woken up from a really long nap on a Sunday. I mean, I don't know if you're ready to wrestle Roman soldiers, take some people down. That's probably not going to happen, much less after crucifixion. And the Romans knew how to crucify people. It's well documented that the Romans perfected this art of torturing and killing people. They would not have made a dumb mistake like letting somebody alive down from a cross. That just didn't happen. And also, Jesus would have had to convince people that he was resurrected before crawling off someplace to die. It just would not have happened like that. If you've ever woken up from a long nap, it's hard to convince people that you're doing great, right? You need a second. You need some coffee. No coffee would have gotten Jesus up and ready to go to show people that he was resurrected. Simply not plausible. So let's move on to number 4. The Jewish authorities or Romans or someone else stole the body, right? The stolen body hypothesis. We'll talk about this and then the disciples. Why does this not make sense? Right? There's clear lack of motive. When you think about the Jewish authorities and the Romans, you think about why. Maybe they had the opportunity to take the body, but why would they do that? Why would they take the body? When the stories of the resurrection started being spread, what would they have done if they had possession of the body? Right? They would have just dragged it out from the corner and said, hey, this resurrection thing, here's the body, right? It would immediately squashed any sort of tales of the resurrection. It just doesn't make sense that they would do something like that. And some people propose, well, maybe it was a grave robber or someone, a soldier trying to make some money off of the side or something like that. What motivates crime today? Right? Some sort of power, some sort of fortune, fame. If any of those things were their motivation, they never got it, right? Because if they meant to be famous, if they thought for some reason that getting the body would get them fame or money, it would have been made known. There's millions of people in and around Jerusalem for the Passover. This is not just done in secret. It would have been made known. Possibility number 4 is not plausible. Possibility number 5, the disciples stole the body. Why does this not make sense? Now, this is what the Jewish authorities in Matthew said happened. Even if you look in 4th century documents, the Talmud, the gathering of rabbinical Jewish writings, this is what the Jewish people were saying what happened to the body. They're saying the disciples just took the body, claimed that there is a resurrection. So why does this not make sense? Even excluding this idea of the guards, people do not die for something they know to be a lie. People do not die for something they know to be a lie. And you might be thinking, people die for lies all the time, right? People die, they consume things that they think are going to make them feel better, right? Or people strap bombs to their chest, run into a crowd. People fly planes into buildings because of lies. Well, they think that they're going to receive something, right? They're convinced about someone else's lie, but they're not the originator of the lie. People do not die for something they know is a lie. When we think about Muhammad starting a new religion, did he die for his new faith? No, he sent other people to die. He himself amassed land, fame, fortune, woman, but he didn't die for his own faith. Right? People do not die for something they know to be a lie. Think about them going off to, we don't know exactly how all the apostles died, but if they're about to be crucified, right? If they're about to be crucified, wouldn't that have been a great time? You're about to be nailed to a cross. Wouldn't that have been a great time to say, hold on. Just kidding. I know that whole resurrection thing, it was just a big joke, right? Just please do not kill me. That's what I would have done if I stole the body of Jesus. But they simply did not do that. Why? Because they couldn't. It wasn't a lie. Jesus was raised from the dead. And also, not one of them confessed to their lie. It's very common today if a group of people are caught in a crime, they all get put into separate interrogation rooms. They all get asked the same questions. And what happens in those interrogation rooms? They're all playing this game of who's going to break first, right? Because whoever breaks first will get a lesser sentence, right? That's how most judicial systems work. You want to be the first to break, to rat out your friends so you get less of a sentence. Now imagine this crime included over 500 people. 1 Corinthians says that 500 people saw the resurrection of Jesus, right? Get 500 people in a room, one of them is going to break, unless what they're telling is the truth. Not one of them confessed. So number 5 is not plausible. And what does that leave us with? Just process of elimination here. Possibility number 6, Jesus rose from the dead. I appreciate your time this morning. We're going to look at 3 different reasons, my favorite reasons why Jesus did rise from the dead. We're going to look at the burial clothes, Paul's conversion, and James, the brother of Jesus's conversion. First, the burial clothes. This is talked about in John chapter 20, verse 6 through 9. Mary has come to the tomb. She's come to offer her gift, and she sees the tomb empty. She runs to tell Peter and John about this, thinking, like most natural people do, somebody took the body. Somebody took the body. What are we going to do? She gets Peter and John. They come running back and looking, starting verse 6. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. If we look at our different 6 possibilities here and just look through them, which of these makes sense with these linen cloths being folded? First, a legend, right? If someone's coming up with a legend, they wouldn't focus on linen cloths. You would have something much more extraordinary. You wouldn't have people disbelieving when they saw the tomb. You would have people immediately believing. You think about option number 2 and 3, this idea of like, well, maybe they got the wrong tomb. Well, if they found the wrong tomb, they wouldn't have seen linen cloths, right? The stolen body hypothesis. If someone stole a body, would they take the time to fold the linen cloths? No. I don't know how much experience you have with stealing dead bodies. I don't have much. But I know if I did, I would not be taking the time to fold some linen cloths, the body cloths separate from the face cloth. No, I would just be getting out of there, right? I'd be getting out there as fast as I could. So Peter sees this. He doesn't understand. Things aren't quite clicking yet for Peter, but John sees the cloths, and even before seeing a risen Jesus, he sees and understands. He believes because of these linen cloths. The only conclusion is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Let's also look at Paul's conversion. We're going to spend some time tonight in Philippians 3, but we're going to go ahead and read Philippians 3, verses 3 through 6. What Paul wrote about himself, his past. Philippians 3, verses 3 through 6. It says, "We are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless." But then we come to verse 7. "But whatever gain I had, I counted as a loss for the sake of Christ." What would cause such a dramatic transformation in someone who persecuted the church? What reasonable explanation would cause such a change? If he went from persecuting the church to giving his life for the church, it doesn't make sense unless something dramatic happened. Once he made that change, you got to think he wasn't liked by anybody. He had been hated by the Jews and also not trusted by the Christians. What did he gain in his life? What do we see from his writings that he could possibly gain from this change? Well, we see in 1 Corinthians that last of all, Jesus appeared to him. George Littleton, he's a 16th or maybe 17th century British politician. He was a poet, he was a graduate from Oxford. He sought to disprove the resurrection of Jesus, specifically looking at Paul's writings. And he studied these for several years, and he concluded that Paul would either have to be a crazy man for doing what he did, or have actually seen the risen Jesus. And because of his study, he became a Christian. He believed that Jesus actually rose from the dead. He said, "I thought the conversion and apostleship of Paul alone, duly considered, was of itself demonstration sufficient to prove Christianity to be a divine revelation." Right? Nothing else explains Paul's change. And finally, James, the brother of Jesus' conversion. If we look in passages like Mark chapter 3, the Gospels paint a consistent narrative that Jesus' family did not believe in him. In Mark 3, verse 21, it says, "And when his family heard it about him being very public about his message, about gathering followers, doing miracles, when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He is out of his mind.'" So James, Joseph, Jude, his brothers, his sisters, potentially even his mom, thought he was crazy. They wanted to seize him because people in this time in Rome, if they start saying things like this, might get killed, might get their family killed for saying things that he was saying. But then we see this very strange transformation. If you look in Galatians chapter 2, in verse 9, what happens to this James? Paul says, "And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised." James, at this time, is a pillar in the church. He is one of the leaders in Jerusalem. So what could have caused that change? What could have caused that change? Well, I would ask you, if you have siblings, what would convince you that your older sibling was the Messiah, right? You all know Nathan, he's here with us today. What would convince me that Nathan was the Messiah, right? What if they got a following, right? They became the target of the government. They were killed by the government. And then 3 days later, their followers said, "Hey, he's risen, he's risen." What would convince you he was actually the Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior of the world? What would convince you? What would convince me? Well, I would have to be very, 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 very sure. I would have to have incredible proof. I would have to feel the holes in Nathan's hands. I'd have to put my hand into his side. And that's what we see what happens. Only in 1 Corinthians, it says in verse 7 that before Jesus appeared to the rest of the disciples, or all the disciples, or all the apostles, Jesus appeared to his brother. And James had an opportunity to see his brother, who had died, was raised from the dead. Now, we don't read about the death of James, the brother of Jesus, in Scripture, but we actually see it in secular writings. This is from Josephus, a Jewish and Roman historian, writing in Antiquities of the Jews. He says, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so the previous high priest at the time had died. So the high priest's son, Ananus, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So in this power vacuum, this man tried to assume the position of high priest. What is his first article of business? This is about 62 AD. What is his first thing to do? So he gets all the Sanhedrin together. He says, I'm gonna kill the brother of Jesus, right? This certainly places him, even in secular history, as dying for his faith in Jesus. What convinced him? Jesus actually rose from the dead. So I know our time today has been brief. Your attention has been wonderful. I want to ask you this question. Do you believe, and also, what does the resurrection of Jesus mean? What does that mean for your life? You might still have questions. I invite you to ask those to me after this. We weren't able to get into all of the different lines of evidence. What does this resurrection mean? We're going to talk a lot about that more at 5 p.m., so I invite you back for that. But I think we could say basically that Jesus is alive. He is reigning in heaven right now. He knows you. He sees you. He has heard this whole worship service. And he has offered himself as a sacrifice for your sins. You have an opportunity now. If you have not become a Christian, if you have not become part of his kingdom and decided to follow him, he offers you forgiveness of sins to be received by faith, to be received through baptism. We invite you, if you have not become a Christian, to please consider that. And also, if you are a Christian, you can believe so firmly that Jesus is alive. Praise be to God. He's left us incredible evidence. He's left us evidence so we can be firm, we can be immovable, steadfast in this world. So let's be thankful as we stand and sing. The roll is called up yonder.